We could put something under that if we needed here. Under the back end. To face it more towards me. Wait a minute. See if that works.
Is that what you meant?
Mm-hmm. Because. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, that might be fine.
Hi.
Hi!
Welcome to This is Mark and Michelle, episode 1.
Episode 1 is right, so excuse the rough edges. Anyway, this is Michelle.
And this is Mark.
And we are formerly an autistic NT couple. We've been married 24 years, and well, almost 24. Anyway, what were you going to say about us?
That he was the same thing he just said.
Oh, okay, all right.
We're on the same page.
No need to be redundant. We're
No.
on the same page.
What happened to the light? There it is.
Okay, all right.
It doesn't
Well,
like the sun.
Okay, well, let's move this way a little bit. Okay, anyway, we'll just sit this close. But anyway, we wanted to give a live, Facebook Live, and talk about a couple of things today. Michelle has taught autistic kids and a few adults for the past 25 years. She's a private music teacher here in Oklahoma City. And throughout all of those years, she's learned how to communicate very well with autistic adults and kids.
Well, and I lived with him for 20 years before he started changing.
That's true. We started the GAPS diet back in July of 2013, and while kids tend to see results in a couple of weeks, it took me 6 weeks to actually start noticing any change in me. And so we're going to also talk about we're going to talk about personality traits that can be seen under the autism. And there is, in the autistic community, at least as far as adults go, a lot of them claim that autism makes them who they are. Well, I'm here to say that it doesn't. It submerged my personality enough so that during the recovery process on the GAPS and the detox, the medical medium's detox diet, my personality came out in force. And we're going to talk about some of those things.
And they were things I had seen glimpses of, but never imagined that he could be who he is now.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about how all of that has happened. And we're going to also talk about developmental gaps in learning. Because I'm finding that a lot of mothers have said, well, as we've recovered our kids, we see that they've had developmental gaps socially, educationally, and that kind of thing. And I thought about that, and I realized those developmental gaps get much worse as you get older. And while I'm an adult, I'm 49, and I've recovered over the past 5 years, there are still numerous social things that I don't get. They're more subtle things now, to whereas when I was autistic, they were much larger, more obvious social things that I didn't get. I have learned a lot in the past 5 years socially and progressed a long way. But some of the more subtle communication things, like non-verbally, as far as body language goes, as far as facial expression goes, I don't quite have those down yet. So anyway, we wanted to start talking about that, and I'm going to start with this first question to Michelle. Can you see personality traits behind the autism in the kids or the adults that you teach?
Yes, but they're buried very deeply depending on how autistic they are. But I have a 17-year-old who's autistic, and he is, most people wouldn't know that he was. He's so close to not being there. But he has girlfriends, and he appears social. He has friends at school. I work at the school where he goes, so I see his relationships. But I can see in his eyes that he's not completely there. And if he is frustrated really often by his autism, especially with the relationships. And I've taught him what autism is because he didn't even know that some of his traits like procrastination and clinginess with a previous girlfriend she complained about, the hyper focus that he got with the girl. I had taught him that was his autism, so he needed to find other ways to use that energy elsewhere so that she's not drowning in him. Does that answer?
That answers. Let me add a second question to this. Some of the traits that you've seen, autistic traits that you've seen in kids and adults over the years that you've taught, do you still see those same traits in older adults? In their 40s, 50s, that kind of thing?
Remind me, who are the adults that I know who are autistic?
Well, your cousin, for one.
Okay.
And
right. What was the question again?
The question being, do you still see the same autistic traits in older adults?
The hyperfocus, you mean like what I was just talking
the
about?
The hyperfocus, the lack of social understanding.
Oh, yes.
The issues, the troubles in communicating.
Yeah, well, it can end in divorce, as we have seen.
That's true.
Many people end up being divorced.
And what we mean by that is we've known a few couples who were NT autistic, and after getting to know those couples, or at least getting to know the spouses separately, we found that they were divorced because the NT member in the couple couldn't really relate to the autistic person in the couple, and so that
and it felt abusive.
Well,
because autism can feel abusive, as most of you know.
Well, you know what? That brings us to this. In our own marriage, I made life very difficult for you.
It wasn't on purpose.
No. Well, that's what I was getting ready to say. All the while not knowing.
Yes.
But being very insistent and stubborn about getting my own way.
Saying horrible things
that
were probably true, but they weren't buffered at all.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point.
And some things that you just didn't perceive correctly, and you just were sure that you perceived them correctly.
Well, and that's the mind blindness.
Yes.
Which now, having lost a good bit of the mind blindness, not all of it, but most of it, I see that other people can see things differently than I do. And that is so nice to see, because I just thought everybody thought like me. I even thought she thought like me. Even though I would hear people express different opinions.
Look, somebody's saying hi. Hi, Jody.
Hey, Jody. So anyway, but hope you're getting something from this.
Ask us a question if you want.
Absolutely. But living with autism can feel abusive, and so out of the couples that we've known, most of the time they've been divorced.
But what's interesting is there's still love there, but they just can't live together.
Well, you mean love from the NT side?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, from the other side. Well, I mean, there is. You were with me.
Yeah. Well, the way I showed love was by doing things and staying no matter what happened.
Right.
Being stubborn, I guess. That in that case, the trait of stubbornness worked in my favor.
Right.
But anyway, more about personality traits. What traits are apparent through the autism?
What do you mean, what traits are
In other words, are there personality traits that stick out through the autism more than others, or does that differ from person to person?
Do you mean the person that's submerged underneath that personality?
Well, yeah, the personality that's submerged under the autism.
You know, I've had students who I didn't see a personality at all. Was
their autism more severe in that case?
I guess it was. But I did see, like, I have my kids draw when they're not doing their piano lesson, and you would see things come out, like they would draw about their interests, maybe history or war. That happened a lot with one of them. But you know, when they're that young, the personality isn't really completely formed because of the developmental delays, which you might want to go into now.
Okay, well, then let's do that.
So it's the 17-year-old that I really saw personality, but the 9, 10-year-old I'm not seeing as much.
Well, back in the late 80s, I had seen a psychiatrist. Oh, what? Sorry.
Don't cover your mouth.
I saw a psychiatrist, and at this point, this was the late 80s, so there was no diagnosis for high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome. And he said, well, you're 18, but you're about 5 or 6 years behind socially. So basically he was saying I had the development of a 12 or 13-year-old at 18. And Jody, we do see your question.
Yeah, we see your question. We'll get you to you.
And we will address that here in just a second, actually. But just to find out, and I still remember that, and that's been a little over 30 years now. And I didn't understand it then, but now I fully understand it, because even at 18, I had gaps, developmental gaps large enough to basically have my mind still stuck in a 12 or 13-year-old state. And that, I'll admit, I don't think that it got worse in the past 30 years, but I do think that because of the autism, I was consistently left out of learning experiences that would have furthered my social, emotional, and communication development.
Right, where NTs would have gotten it on the playground.
Exactly.
Talk about, I lost my train. Go on.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Well, we'll come back to it later.
Yeah,
but as far as the developmental traits go, let's see. Well, I was going to ask her what developmental gaps she sees in her autistic kids. But
social, completely. I mean, they don't have it at all.
Mm-hmm.
None.
Does that differ from kid to kid?
Depends on how autistic
the severity,
they are.
in other words?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
How deep they are submerged.
Mm-hmm. And
but you couldn't, you were that, even at 40, whatever age,
43
you
when we
were,
started.
yeah, you were really, I mean, you can't receive emotion, and so you can't learn that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's an interesting, I had another question on this list. What traits did Michelle see come out in me during recovery and detox? So, Jody, here's the answer to your question. The question that Jody's asking, in case anybody can't see it or hasn't seen it, what else did we do besides the medical medium detox?
Hi, David!
David! David's a friend of ours. He's a psychologist close by. But as far as the other diets, we did the medical medium detox starting in January of this year. Well, in the first 2 weeks, I lost, I'm assuming, most of my heavy metals, because every time I had to pee, it was gray. So I'm assuming that those were metals, and I would think that that was the case, considering the changes that I went through afterwards, and Michelle saw those more than I did. Let me see if I can explain this right. She said that my words and my emotions matched up.
Yes,
so
for the first time ever.
So that means I had a complete communicative intent. My emotions and my words lined up, so everything came across without being confusing to the person that I was talking to.
So we had been on the GAPS diet since
2013. So it was 4.5 years before we started the medical medium diet.
And the GAPS diet never did that for him. He had plateaued and sometimes would go backwards, even though he was eating some of this, all the same foods. And it was when he got these metals out of him when I saw that happen. I don't think GAPS is going to be the end-all, be-all.
No.
I don't want to make everybody mad, but I think this medical medium diet is going to do a lot more for people.
Yeah, it's. I haven't yet been able to talk to anyone who's been able to recover their kid using just the medical medium detox diet. But once I do,
but I have on the medical medium group page.
Mm-hmm.
People have completely healed their kids.
Okay, well that's interesting because the GAPS was great for me.
It took you a long way.
It did. It opened up an emotional world, a three-dimensional world that hitherto was two-dimensional and very black and white.
Jody wants to know when you were diagnosed.
Okay.
With autism.
I was actually diagnosed the year before we started the diet, and that was in June of 2012. And so I spent that next year from 2012 to 2013 getting to grips with my autism, knowing what it was, and how it operated in my mind and that kind of thing. So that was a real help. Fortunately, I never ran into anyone who said you can't heal your autism, because had I probably would have believed it. I mean, most people with high-functioning autism are very literal-minded, and I was. So I got lucky. But then I always listen to Michelle because she goes on her intuition so well. She doesn't watch TV, and she doesn't watch Oprah. But in July of 2013, she happened to watch Oprah and TV. So she turned it on, and Louise Hay was on there. At least I think this is the correct episode. And she was, Louise Hay was talking about the GAPS diet. And so Michelle noticed that, noted it. She looked it up and did a little bit of research into it. And then a few days later, she talked to me about it. And I thought, well, I've spent almost 30 years being a professional cook. So doing the broths and the stocks and that kind of thing weren't a problem for me. That was easy because I'd worked numerous places where that was my main job, making soups, making stocks, making sauces. So the cooking wasn't an issue for me. And having gone to school for anthropology and then after that biology, the science behind it made plenty of sense. So I thought, you know what? I understand this. This makes some kind of logical sense. I said, so I really had no fears of starting it. So we jumped in.
Yeah, we were like, what's the worst that can happen? We feel better?
Well, and
right?
Yeah, and exactly that's what happened. We started feeling better. And it wasn't until 6 weeks that I actually saw any improvements. We happened to be at my sister's daughter's birthday party in late August. And
so that was August after the July that we started.
Exactly, 6 weeks later. And so Michelle was sitting across the room, and I happened to be looking at Michelle. I didn't know what I was doing at all. I just was looking at Michelle, and Michelle says really loud, pointing directly at me, "He's throwing emotion at me. Look, look!"
It was novel.
Well, and it was novel. I still didn't really understand what was going on.
Yeah,
then.
he didn't know he was doing it.
Yeah, but later on I figured it out. And so about a year later was when we were able to actually start looking at each other and know what each was thinking. Consistent.
That was weird to him.
That was weird to me because I'm like, wow, I can read her mind. Ooh, that's cool.
I was like, oh no, he can read my mind.
Well, because her mind had been private all those years. It had been private
for many years.
And so I had to outright ask all the previous years, so what are you thinking? Now I didn't have to, and she hated that, and she felt creeped out.
Yeah, it was kind of creepy.
But anyway, but those were some of the things that came online for me. But let's see. Jody, that's really cool. In June of 2012, y'all started the GAPS diet? And you apparently know Louise Hay, or at least have read her. That's cool. Oh, hey, David, tell Garrett we said hi.
Hi, Garrett.
Yeah, but anyway, so as far as other questions go, maybe we'll just kind of ramble a little for a few more minutes and see what comes up. But
talk about implicit versus explicit learning.
This was a major thing for me.
Your college career.
I went to culinary school for a year between 91 and 92. But being an Aspie, I was just going through the motions because I didn't really understand what learning was about. I tried really hard. I read books on learning. I read books on studying. None of those made sense to me. And so
we're in the middle of writing our book. It probably won't be out for like a year or so, but we're in the middle of it.
We're actually doing Hay House's writer's workshop, and so we're putting the stuff together for a book proposal in September. And so we're building the platform now, obviously, with the live and that kind of thing. But stay tuned. You will hear about it right before it comes out.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you. But as far as implicit and explicit, I had such trouble in school. The anthropology degree was fairly easy because it was just reading and keeping things in mind and being able to discuss them. I started the biology degree, and I started organic chemistry and calculus and things like this, and I struggled severely because it was huge amounts of information, but even more so was this. When you're autistic, you have to have things explicitly explained to you in excruciating detail. Excruciating for an NT.
Yes.
And,
painful, yes.
Well, painful, and it's funny, now I can see the pain on her face, and so I know when to stop.
But he's had the experience now.
I have had the experience.
With having to help an autistic person, so.
Exactly. And that's been very enlightening for me because it shows me where I am, or where I was,
yeah.
But it shows me where I am now.
Yes.
And he's 24, and we're working on educating him in interviewing for jobs, on writing resumes and that kind of thing. And so I have to be very explicit in what I say, and I have to explain what I'm doing while I'm doing it, and I have to explain why things have to be done a certain way.
Why is always big.
Why is top priority.
Why
is definitely top.
And how did that affect your college?
Well, here's how it affected college. Because people with high-functioning autism have to have things explained so detail-oriented. Teachers teach to NTs.
Right.
Well, and that's fine because 99% or 98% of the class are NTs. So implicit teaching and implicit learning is what goes on in a large classroom, well, any classroom, even if it's one-on-one. Because she can tell you that with her NT students, she doesn't really have to use words.
Yeah, I
much.
hardly have to say anything.
Right.
If you compare it to the autistic kids.
Right. And so when you have autism, you have to learn. You have to know all the details, and it has to be taught to you in a very tedious, step-by-step manner. Now, when you're in an organic chemistry 1 class with 220-something other people, teacher ain't got time for all that.
Nobody got time for that.
Well, that's true. Nobody got time for all that. And when you're in other biology classes with a mountain of information, for instance, microbiology. Microbiology is nothing but bacteria, obviously. But just the sheer volume of information you have to be able to pick up as an autistic person, it's very difficult and very frustrating to do that in 16 weeks of 1 semester. So I took classes over and over because I failed and failed and failed. I took Organic Chemistry 1 7 times, and I still didn't pass it. I needed a C. My best grade was a C minus. That was the 6th time I took it. I tried to take it again a 7th time and I got a D, and I just gave up. Calculus I had to take 5 times. Genetics I took 3 times. I finally passed it with a C, and I was happy with that. Let's see. I think those are good enough examples. There were a few others.
Yeah.
General chemistry was the same way. I had to take it 3 times. But anyway.
You're persistent.
I'm definitely persistent. And that has saved me, though.
Yeah.
The persistence has taken the place of my my inabilities in certain areas, like learning, like social functioning, and that kind of thing. My persistence has definitely paid off. But those are things that have to be kept in mind. Parents don't need to keep that in mind. You see it every day. But teachers really need to be trained in this. And I'm not talking about just special needs teachers. I'm talking about every teacher.
Well, because my experience has been even ADHD have to be taught like this, because I have a lot of ADHD kids too. There's a spectrum, and it depends on where those heavy metals get placed in the brain, whether it's ADHD or ADD or depression or autism. And if they're in there, though, you have to teach them all differently, because there are things that are blocked that aren't allowing them to receive normally.
Exactly. And I didn't know truthfully, what my problem was until I went through the recovery on the GAPS diet. And then finding, my implicit ability to learn and to communicate came on automatically.
That was really cool.
It was really cool because I was able to pick up things without having to try. That was amazing because I didn't have to question her endlessly about what she meant. I just knew. But I also realized, too, that implicit understanding and implicit communication is also your intuition at work.
Right, which was completely closed off as an autistic person.
I should say it was almost completely closed off. There were times when I would get information in my head out of nowhere, and I didn't know why. I later found out that was my intuition. I am a claircognizant person. Information just comes to me in my head. But then I also realized that the way that information came to me into my head was exactly the same way information came to me implicitly in communication between me and someone else. And I thought, well, it must be the same mechanism. So I'm quite sure that NTs, for the most part, we really mainly communicate intuitively by picking up implicitly what we mean instead of having to spend all the time
instead of having to say it all.
And saying it all in detail and in step by step. So hopefully these questions and answers have been helpful. But as far as the diet goes, we're actually going to spend another Facebook Live on the 2 diets because I found that the detox diet did almost as much, maybe as much for me as GAPS did. And that was only in 2 months.
I think it did more for you.
Well, we'll talk about that in another Facebook Live.
Yeah, that's complicated.
It is complicated. Anyway, but if you have other questions, please post them on Heal Your Autism here on Facebook. Or if you know our other page, Happy Robot Coaching, you can post the questions there and we'll answer them as well. Anything else you want to say?
No. That was pretty cool. It was fun.
That was pretty cool. It did work out.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Yep. Have a good day. Thanks.
There were 5 at one point.
Yay!
High five. See you next time.